Hi. Thank you, everybody. Well, this morning, a number of us reflected on the deep history that is represented in our gathering. And part of it is very related to the Lindisfarne Association that was created by William Irwin Thompson in the early 1970s. And Francisco and I were both fellows in the Lindisfarne Association, and Evan grew up in it. And I said this morning that Lindisfarne was a kind of crucible for many of us, a context where we could exchange our ideas, our aspirations, but where there was a kind of alchemy that happened in our interactions with each other that really expanded our horizons and deepened our understanding of each other's fields. And with the intention in a certain way of creating a place, a subtle geography of friendship. And so you're in the midst, all of you who are here, of a friendship between Richie Davidson, Al Kazniak, Adam Frank, John Dunn, Evan Thompson. And our time together is directed toward the exploration of emergence, but also really in the context of radical uncertainty. And so I want to invite Al, who will moderate this weekend, to open up the subject, the sort of opening the treasure house. But I also really want to thank Richie, Ev, Adam Frank, John Dunn, and Al for these years of collaboration, and also our, sort of holding the background. This is Kigaku Noah, who you just met, Joanne, who is also online with us, and various others of the Upaya staff and volunteers who make all this possible. And speak to my gratitude for Amy Varela and the Mind and Life Europe community for bringing Amy and Hanna de Yeager and Elena Antonova into the mandala of exploration that we're opening up in the context of this Varela International Symposium. So Al.
Thank you so much, Roshi. So a very warm welcome to each of the faculty here with us for this initial session, and also to all of you who are attending this symposium. Because it's now the very early pre-dawn hours for our European faculty members, they won't be able to join us for this initial hour. However, I'll be representing them with the following overview of the arc of our symposium, so they won't get left out. I think it goes without saying that very little seems certain or predictable in our rapidly shifting current world. How do we understand and respond to unexpected phenomena that emerge in everything from our biology and development through the conscious awareness of individual selves to complex societies and even the cosmos? In recent decades, research and scholarship in several disciplines has led to new understandings of how it is that the constantly changing dynamic interactions within complex systems of the universe, the entire planet, our individual biology, and interconnected societies can give rise to unexpected new phenomena. This work has grown from formative early contributions made by Francisco Varela, the neuroscientist, philosopher, and Buddhist practitioner in whose honor this symposium is named. These contributions include, among others, the concept of autopoiesis in life, developed in collaboration with Humberto Maturana, who recently died, and the ways in which complex dynamic living systems embody and enact cognitive processes. On a human scale, Francisco's seminal perspectives on uncertainty and emergence in complex dynamic systems have important implications for understanding processes as diverse as how we develop as individual selves to how large-scale social change emerges. The recent forces that both reflect and have influenced emergence in complex human systems range from a viral pandemic to worldwide protests, from the climate catastrophe to economic instability. Extraordinary global shifts have made it, I think, increasingly apparent that unique personal and social transformations emerge from the changing dynamic interactions within the complex systems of our brains and bodies, and within our equally complex societies and the more than human environment. As Roshi has already mentioned, this year's Varela International Symposium is co-organized by Upaya Zen Center and Institute of Santa Fe, Mind and Life Europe, and Nirakara, and commemorates the 20th anniversary of Francisco Varela's passing in 2001, and the 30th anniversary of the publication of the influential book, The Embodied Mind, co-authored by Francisco Varela, Evan Thompson, and Eleanor Roche. Our agenda over these next couple of days is going to include faculty presentations, discussant comments, panel discussions, and opportunities for some participant Q&A. And just as importantly, meditation sessions, as well, of course, as meal and body kindness breaks. Following an initial period of lightly guided meditation practice tomorrow, Saturday morning for those of us in the Americas, philosopher Evan Thompson will offer the symposium's first presentation on the topic of enaction, hope, and coordinated knowing. So, Evan, would you please introduce yourself and say a few words about your presentation tomorrow, as well as your personal and intellectual connections with Francisco?
Thank you, Al. It's wonderful to be here with all of you. I am in Vancouver, and that is where I live most of the time, although I also spend a great deal of time in the Slocan Valley in the interior of British Columbia and the Kootenay Mountains, especially this past year. And our theme, as Al mentioned, is emergence and uncertainty in self and society. And I'm going to be addressing that theme. The title of my talk is Enacting Hope and Coordinated Knowing. And the talk has, I suppose, in a way, three parts. The first part is to contrast different ways of responding to uncertainty in terms of how we think about knowledge and the relationship of knowledge and worldview, or epistemology, to use the philosopher's term. And I'm going to be contrasting two kinds of epistemologies: crisis epistemology and epistemology of coordination. And these are terms I'm taking from the Indigenous American philosopher and thinker Kyle White, whose work I highly recommend to everyone. And he makes the point that crisis epistemology is a way of trying to find certainty by framing time as having been stable and then disrupted and requiring urgent action. Often it's framed in terms of apocalyptic narratives. And although some of us find it very natural to think in that way, he thinks that this very much distorts our understanding and ability to respond to the climate crisis. In one way, because it's a narrative that excludes Indigenous peoples who have long been living in a dystopian world that would not be recognized by their ancestors. And so the idea that we're only now facing a crisis would be foreign to them. And he contrasts this with the idea of coordination epistemology, which is knowing the world in a way that emphasizes kinship bonds, relationships, and especially relationships of kinship to the more than human world. So my starting point is going to be to contrast these two different epistemologies and then to relate it back to some earlier thinking of the cybernetics era. And here is where the Lindisfarne influence comes into it for me, the thinking of the anthropologist and cybernetic systems theorist Gregory Bateson, who was a strong influence on Francisco Varela, who was a friend of Francisco's and my father, William Irwin Thompson. I first met Francisco Varela because my father and Gregory Bateson invited him to a Lindisfarne conference in 1978 called Mind and Nature. This was when Gregory Bateson was writing his last book, Mind and Nature, A Necessary Unity. And in Bateson's book, Steps to an Ecology of Mind, he contrasts what he calls conscious purpose, which is a version, or you might say it's the deeper source of crisis epistemology in the way he's using the term, because he used the term to mean a kind of selective biased awareness that emphasizes limited purposes and means and linear thinking. And Bateson contrasts this with what he called wisdom, which is the ability to think systemically, to recognize complexity and to think in terms of systemic, complex relationships. And so I'm going to use his ideas to give a larger framing of the contrast between crisis thinking and coordination thinking. And that will flow into a discussion of enactive cognitive science, which Francisco was the major architect of and is an intellectual heir to Bateson's work. So I'll spend some time sketching some ideas of that are central to enactive cognitive science that are helpful for thinking about this idea of systemic wisdom, especially in the face of climate change, the climate crisis. And then so that will be the second part. And then I will end with some ideas about hope and wisdom and love that come out of these different strands of thinking, that come out of Bateson, that come out of Kyle White, and that are also connected to another of our faculty participants who's not here at the moment, Hannah de Yeager, who's written about loving and knowing from the enactive perspective.
Thank you so much, Evan. Really appreciate it and can't wait to hear your talk.
Thank you.
Following Evan, astrophysicist Adam Frank will offer a presentation entitled Planetary Intelligence in 3 Acts. So Adam, would you please introduce yourself and say a few words about what you'll discuss, including how Francisco's work has influenced your thinking? You have to unmute, Adam.
So thank you. First of all, let me say again, what a pleasure it is. I feel like I'm a relative newcomer to this friendship. And, this is, I think, my 3rd time that I've done this. But I have to say, even from the first time, it was transformative for me being brought into this group because the dynamic is so remarkable. So I thank Upaya for giving me the opportunity again. So to introduce myself, I am an astrophysicist and a writer. I live in Rochester, New York, upstate New York, originally from the New York, New Jersey area, from Jersey, which defines a lot of my personality and also gives me my baud rate, my rapid speech. So I will try as best as I can to slow that down. So what I'm, as the resident physicist at this, as astrophysicist, it's my job to sort of pull back for the 10,000 light year view. And what I'm going to talk about is something that is some research that I've been doing recently, which, some of which comes out of the discussions we've had over the last few years in this group. But what I'm interested in is the emergence. So the part of emergence here that's really important for me, the emergence of intelligence on planets, not just Earth, but planets in general. We usually think of intelligence as being something, that is individuals have, but I think, there's research now when astrophysicists or astrobiologists are thinking about life. we're moving away from thinking about life is that something that happens in a puddle, on some, warm part of a planet. Instead, life isn't something that happens on a planet. It's something that happens to a planet. That once life emerges on a world, it completely transforms the world. And what emerges from this is an entirely different class of planet, a different whole other behavior that is possible in what we call the coupled planetary systems. And the idea that I want to pursue is that intelligence actually should be seen the same way. Using ideas that Lindsay Farn and Francisco developed, things like emergence and the reliance on networks and thinking about boundaries and particularly autopoiesis, that one takes this perspective on the evolution of a world, that once life begins, once it reaches a certain level of networked complexity, that intelligence emerges, even on a world without a technological civilization, that cognition and knowing can be thought of as occurring on planetary scales. And that once you adopt this perspective, it changes your understanding of the relationship between biospheres and the non-living environment. So I want to pursue this idea because I believe that the three acts that I want to cover are a planet without a technological civilization, which, is one of the important things for people to understand is we are poised right now. We are just on the lip of really beginning the search for life in the universe. Whereas, we had 2,500 years of people basically yelling at each other with their opinions over whether there were other worlds that might be inhabited. We are now, a decade, 2 decades, 3 decades, 4 decades away from having data, from having actual data that will be relevant to this question. Now, what we'll see, what we find, we don't know. But we're leaving the domain where it was just a hypothetical. So this question of life and planets now matters a great deal for our understanding of life in the universe, but also because we now understand the Earth's long history. We can see how life has transformed the planet and potentially intelligence has transformed the planet over its long history. And then you get to us, the second act, which is the Anthropocene. We are now the dominant force on the planet in terms of shaping the coupled planetary systems of oceans, ice, etc. And it's clear that we are intelligent. We have developed this highly networked technological civilization, but it's not clear at all that you could say we have planetary intelligence. And that's what I want to distinguish. There's intelligence, and then there's this idea of planetary intelligence, where cognition is enacted, where agency is enacted on a planetary scale. And the third act that I want to reach to is what I will call techno signatures, which people know as SETI, right? The search for extraterrestrial intelligence, because that's also part of, as we begin to look for, as we begin to get data relevant to life on other worlds, that data will also, there's no reason to think that there might not also be signatures of technological civilizations as well. And so I'm one of the teams, a recent NASA grant, the first NASA grant that was given in a very long time, that is beginning to kind of sculpt this science. And the way you have to think about this naturally brings you to questions of long-term sustainability and hence global cognitive behavior, global agency being enacted in order for you to last a long time. Like we have a civilization that's maybe 200 years. Do civilizations get to be 10,000 years old, 100,000 years old, 1 million years old? And by civilization, I mean the kind that is deploying large-scale energy-intensive technologies. So that will be the third act, and that's where we'll close. And again, the whole focus really on this is what's happening to us now and how might we have a better sense of where to go. And just to end, to think about Francisco, I never met Francisco. And I didn't really know about his work until much later. It was when I was writing my first book, 10 years ago, 12 years ago, that I came across the embodied mind. And I have to say, I'm a little jealous. When I think about Lindsay Farn in New York in 1978, I was like coming in from Jersey on the PATH train, getting involved in semi-illegal activities, running around the city. And, But I was already interested in philosophy. And the one thing I'll point out is that actually one of the books that changed my life was William Irwin Thompson's The Time Falling Bodies Take to Light. I read that when I was in 1981, and that book transformed my thinking. And so in that way, I sort of feel connected to this stream in that way. So I'm and only now that I've learned Francisco's ideas in depth over the last, say, 5 or 6 years, I'm stunned by the breadth and depth of his genius. So I'll end there.
Thank you so much, Adam. Always exciting to hear from you. And we're so grateful that you're parking your spaceship here on Zoom long enough to spend the weekend with us. Clinical psychologist Amy Cohen Varela, who is hopefully deeply asleep as we speak, and therefore not here online with us, is going to be our third presenter on the topic of uncertainty, living systems, and grieving. Amy specializes in psychodynamic therapy and philosophy, and she's also the chairperson of the Mind and Life Europe board and has been involved with Mind and Life ever since its inception. In reflections based on her long clinical experience, her personal relationship with Francisco Varela, and her formal study of his theoretical contributions, her talk is going to explore the nature of life and living systems in terms of how they apply to the experience of grieving. Amy will describe grief as a thoroughly relational process, calling on the psyche to go beyond its identity by internalizing, as she puts it, traces of what has been lost, thus lodging otherness at the very heart of the self. This necessary internalization makes of grief a fully fledged process of development, and as Amy will argue, presents an opportunity for affirmation and expansion of the self. The final presentation of our first full day will be by Buddhism and contemplative humanities scholar John Dunn, enlightening us on what we see is not water, what we believe is not true. So John, please introduce yourself and tell us a bit about what you'll be addressing, including, if you would, connections to Francisco's contributions.
Sure, thank you, Al. It's great to be back and to see everyone, at least virtually. Adam there on the deck of the Rocinante. So yes, indeed. It's really a pleasure to be back, as I say, and I'm looking forward to the weekend. I don't really know what I'm going to say. Everyone else seems to be quite sure. A lot of certainty going on around here. I'm like deep in the uncertainty right now about what I'm going to say. Of course, I wrote something up, and you can read about it on the website, and I will say something about it. But I'm actually I sort of do this at the Varela Symposium anyway, but I also think in a certain way, I really want to hear more about what others are going to say, since I'm going to be ending the day tomorrow, and I'm hoping I can, in some ways, kind of respond to what I hear tomorrow. But I can tell you some basic things that are really running around for me in my head or in my mind and heart that actually, in some ways, actually relate also to Francisco Varela's influence on me. The title of my talk comes from a very famous metaphor in Buddhist philosophy, the philosophy especially that inspires the non-dual Buddhist traditions. This is the philosophy known as Yogacara, the practice of yoga philosophy. And it says that it's a very simple metaphor in some ways. It simply says, what we humans see as water, flowing by in a river, for example, the gods experience that as nectar. And the poor hungry ghosts, the pretas, experience it as pus. And the point here is not that there's one of these experiences is the true experience of what is being seen. They're all equally true, or actually, in a certain way, they're all equally false. So this perspective, part of what this perspective is telling us is that the worlds we inhabit are worlds that we actually construct together. That what seems to be our individual experience is actually always, in a certain way, a kind of communal experience. And that togetherness is not just a nice, loving togetherness. It's loving to those that we care for who are in our in-group, but it's also one that excludes the other, where the otherness is, in a certain sense, as Amy is going to say tomorrow, it's kind of at the heart of our own identity of ourselves, and ourselves, which are group selves, actually, right? A self is, you can't, as the famous developmental psychologist Helen Marcus likes to say, you can't be a self alone. Right. So always our self is a kind of corporate self in some sense, a self that's formed in social relation. The other is always part of that, but often the other is part by being excluded. So one question that I have that's been really important for me lately, actually, is how do we imagine a world without exclusion? How do we have love without exclusion? How do we have a world, our sense of what is the good, the beautiful, the right, the true, without excluding those who have an alternative sense of the good, the beautiful, the right, and the true? Who's going to win this argument, actually? Is that the way we need to proceed? Have we ever proceeded in any other way historically? Is there a chance of doing something else? These are incredibly important questions because, of course, we know that one of the biggest problems we face right now, of course, we have climate change, we have racial injustice, we have so many difficulties in the world, but especially the pandemic, and the incredible absurdity of our response to the pandemic becoming politicized in the way that it has, our response to the climate crisis becoming politicized in the way that it has, the incredible polarization. And just today, I happened to come across an article in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that I shared with our fellow panelists, which basically suggests that there's a correlation between how certain you are and how polarized you are. So one of the really themes that I'd like to bring up is that if we're going to have hopes and dreams about the future, of course, famously, we have a very important practice in the non-dual traditions of abandoning all hopes and fears. But if we're going to try to then step out of that and create a certain sense of what the hope for the future is, how do we do that without falling back into this exclusion? How do we do it without basically becoming slaves to our own ideology? So that, I think, is going to be the challenge for us going forward. And it's also, from the Buddhist perspective, a real challenge. How do we, in a sense, do our world making? How do we have hopes without being subject to our own small sense, our own, maybe not so small, maybe it's part of a large scale society, part of the big fiction that enables us to create the world of America or France or Spain or whiteness or whatever else it might be. Whatever story we tell ourselves to make our world, how do we create a future, have hopes for a future without grasping, clinging to the reality of what is actually unreal?
Thank you, John. And
Oh boy.
I'm so grateful for the role that you reliably play as Varela Symposium resident provocateur. So after the initial guided meditation on day 2, the first presentation will be by neuroscientist Richie Davidson, also one of our core faculty in the Varela Symposium, with the title of Gleaning the Path from Contemplative Neuroscience, Predictive Coding, Self, and the Practical Possibility of Microdosing at Scale. So, Richie, the title is certainly fascinating. Please introduce yourself and say a few words about your presentation, also, again, including connections to Francisco's thinking.
Thank you so much, and it's great to be with all of you. I miss being at Upaya and very much look forward to convening there on our next occasion. And it's just good to feel all of you virtually. As we were sharing about Francisco, I talked about some anecdotes this afternoon. I'll share another one, a different one this evening. In May of 2001 was the an occasion where His Holiness the Dalai Lama was visiting Madison, Wisconsin, where I am now, where I live. And we had a small convening of scientists with His Holiness, and Francisco was scheduled to attend that meeting. And it was just before, literally a few days before that meeting was to occur, that Francisco's health took a downward turn. And I received a call from Francisco saying that he would be unable to travel. In his place, he asked to send, I believe it was his last student, although correct me if that's not true, Evan, Antoine Lutz. Antoine came to Madison then and ended up staying, I think, for 9 years, thinking that this would be a short visit. But the poignant moment in this was, now this was 2001, this was before Zoom existed, before Skype existed. And His Holiness we had a video link to Francisco's bed. He was at home in his bed. And this was, I believe, the last time that His Holiness and Francisco saw one another, at least in this way. And it was the final words that they each shared with one another. And it was such a powerful moment. It, for me, really underscored the extraordinary groundedness in practice that Francisco embodied. And it got stronger and stronger as he became more and more ill. That will stay with me forever, that moment. And I'm deeply appreciative that I was present to witness it. So what I'm going to talk about, as I said this afternoon, I love preparing for these talks. And the honest truth is I prepare more for my Upaya talks than I prepare for any other talks that I give. And I love it. I sometimes think to myself before I get started, oh my God, what did I get myself into again? But it's always a joy once I actually get myself into it. So I'm going to put together a bunch of things that hopefully will be thematically related, but actually follow on from John's presentation. So it will be a really, I think, beautiful segue. So one of John's points is that what we see in the world is like a dream. It's all constructed, and it fundamentally is no different from a dream. And that's also true with what we refer to as the self. It too is comprised of the same ephemeral construction as everything else. So I'll talk a little bit about that. I'll talk a little bit about some of the neuroscience around that, and talk about the practices that we have learned about in the Buddhist path that help us to directly see that and to go beyond that. I'll talk about stages along the path and what we've learned about that neuroscientifically. I'll talk a little bit about predictive coding and how the giving up of predictive coding completely, if you will, is likely to accompany this non-dual state that John was referring to. And then this business of microdosing, if we have any hope to really change the world, and I think all of us who are participating in this seminar have the aspiration that the world indeed change. And I think many of us have the conviction that if it doesn't change, we're really in serious trouble. Not that we're not now, but we'll be in even more trouble if it doesn't begin to shift in certain ways. And I think a lot of the fundamental problems that exist on the planet today are fundamentally problems of self-centeredness, of excessive identification with the self. We, that when wherever we're with the Dalai Lama, he reminds us that there are 7 billion people, and we need to figure out ways of reaching the masses, of scaling. One of the things that I frequently remind people is that we as a species have learned some remarkable things. Virtually every human being on the planet brushes their teeth. And this is not part of our genome. This is actually something that we've all learned to do for our personal physical hygiene. And what we're now interested in are practices on the same time scale, maybe shorter, that can be sprinkled throughout a day. And in the Buddhist view, we have view, meditation, and application. And in many ways, you can think of this as applied practice, as applied Dharma. And if it is delivered in the right time and in the right place, it can have, we think, really powerful effects. And so the delivery in the proper time and space is really crucial here. And there is evidence showing, and this is not flaky evidence, this is evidence in the mainstream scientific literature, that interventions that are as short as 15 minutes can change the likelihood of a underrepresented minority in the United States going to college or not. From a 15-minute intervention that occurred 7 years before. And so I think that we have, if nothing else, a moral obligation to explore everything we can to change, to disseminate these kinds of strategies. And this is something that many, many years ago, the Dalai Lama said, please take the practices from our tradition, turn them into a form that anyone would feel comfortable doing, investigate them scientifically, and if you find them valuable, disseminate them widely. And this I take to be my assignment for the remainder of my time on this planet. And this talk is part of it. So thank you.
Oh, Richie.
Thank you, Richie. Very tantalizing.
Yeah.
I
Hey, Al,
personally
can I
can't
just
wait. Go right ahead, Richie.
Yeah, I was just going to say, Richie, I'm just completely delighted about what you're proposing. I actually have just entered into an agreement with Shambhala because I've produced a series of actually 52 what I call micro-reflective practices. These are these tiny interventions that are accessible to anyone. I'm going to stand on your research and enthusiasm as I finish this work for Shambhala. I'm really, really thrilled with what you're suggesting.
Great. Well, we'll have to talk.
We will. I'll yes, we do have to talk.
And could I just quickly say, because I didn't actually say anything really about Francisco Varela. I remember that day in 2001, Richie. We had just started collaborating. And wow, what a move. There wasn't a dry eye in that room.
No.
It was really, really something else. And but I also should say that, you know, my connection with Francisco, I did talk to him a couple of times very briefly about the book Sleeping, Dreaming, and Dying, when I was helping Wisdom Publications put that together, that Roshi Joan is also in, from a Mind and Life meeting with His Holiness the Dalai Lama. But really my connection, which I cherish a great deal, is precisely through someone you mentioned, Antoine Lutz, and also Evan. Like, in many ways, I feel like the lineage, I'm kind of receiving the lineage of Francisco, mostly through them, and that his perspectives with Antoine, especially, you know, around neurophenomenology. And, you know, as you know, Richie, I've been doing a lot of work in that area, and but also, and with Evan, I think it's really kind of for the philosophical perspectives on an action in general, but that's moved into 4E cognition for me more broadly. But then also just kind of that systems perspective, that when that came along made a lot of sense to me, in part because of what the Buddhist philosophical work I've done. But in other ways, it's really just a completely fresh idea. It's I think, historically an unprecedented idea, and Francisco, and certainly through the embodied mind, and then Evan's book, Mind and Life, really sort of was masterful in presenting that in a way that had a huge impact on me.
Yeah, and John, I also was in the room when that encounter happened. And Richie, you know, it was, as you said, there was not a dry eye in the place. And talk about compassion, which is something Francisco touched deeply into as his lived experience. One of the most compassionate people I've ever encountered. But also to see His Holiness's face when he saw Francisco, and he knew that this would be the last time of meeting his friend in this intimate but virtual way. So I'm so grateful, Richie, for what you set up, making it possible for that encounter to happen, and also for us to be in a certain way. It was a first-person experience to first-person experience. We were the sort of second persons, if you will, in that encounter. And I think that all of us shared a very similar response, which was to witness compassion literally blooming in our midst, a sense both of beauty and also of great brokenheartedness.
Thank you, Roshi, and John and Richie. So just to close the circle of what we'll be doing the next 2 days, the second presentation of day 2 will be by neuroscientist Elena Antonova, again, who should be deeply asleep right now, won't be with us for this session. She'll be presenting on being like writing on the water. Elena is a senior lecturer. The North American equivalent of that is associate professor in psychology at Brunel University, London, which she joined in June of 2019. And prior to that, she was a lecturer at the Institute of Psychiatry, Psychology, and Neuroscience, King's College London, where she remains a visiting researcher. Lena is going to be exploring the principles of change within a complex systems approach, a topic, of course, that Francisco pioneered, radically altering how many sciences now approach the study of change and transformation. As she'll describe, nonlinear change, which characterizes much of nature, is often abrupt and discontinuous, resulting in periods of turbulence or critical fluctuations, as she'll describe it, the system destabilizing, creating the potential for phase or order transitions. Elena is going to illustrate with examples from her own neuroscientific research how mindfulness meditation can destabilize the mind-brain system, creating opportunities for transition to new patterns of organization and new experiential possibilities. So our final presentation of day 2 will be given by philosopher Hanna de Yeager on the topic of enactive epistemology and enactive ethics, ways of participating. Hanna is a philosopher of cognitive science and associate professor in the Department of Philosophy at the University of the Basque Country, and the 2021 to 2022 Wall Scholar at the Peter Wall Institute for Advanced Studies, University of British Columbia. In her presentation, Hanna will examine recent developments in the enactive approach to life and mind, which have led us to look into questions of ethics and epistemology as well as their relation. She'll argue that what is most characteristically human is how we know to live together with others in intersubjective relations that are mutually transformative. So this will lead Hanna to a comparison between the processes involved in knowing and processes of human relating, particularly those of loving. And I'll just note that perhaps some of you who are joining us for this symposium may already be struck by how often that word love or loving has been mentioned by our faculty members. She'll conclude with her thoughts about implications of this enactive participatory epistemology for ethics. So that's the arc of what we'll be doing together the next 2 days. And I think as all of you have been able to discern in what you've heard, just as little tantalizing tidbits so far, our faculty presentations are going to be rich, stimulating, and provocative, as will, I think, their panel discussions and interactions between themselves and with those of you participating in this symposium. So at this point, I want to pause just for a second, Roshi, and turn to you. We have a little over 10 minutes left of our appointed time. Various things we might do, but what's your inclination?
You know, I was just marveling at the thread that unifies all of our presentations, and you mentioned it, and that is the thread of love. And looking through some of Francisco's writings, I came across a question asked by Otto Sharma about the role of love. And he posed this question to Francisco. And I want to share what Francisco's response was, because I think it's really remarkable. He says, the more the fragile self-subject deploys itself, the more compassion deploys itself, because that's what it is. The more there is the opening into space to accommodate or to take care of the other, there is a kind of intrinsic decenteredness, and therefore the other appears closer. So, you know, this practice that we do, and why Francisco's work, for me personally, is so remarkable, is that the return again and again to what the three sort of phases of suspension, redirection, and then letting go, or what Hanna de Yeager and her associates would call letting be, this experience of being decentered as the very foundation of our practice. Francisco then said solidarity, compassion, care, love, all of the different modes of being together appear when the self is decentered. And he goes on. Now that to me is a great gift of the universe, since we are not solid and private. And this is one of the points that Francisco has made again and again in his work. There is no such thing as a private self, since we are not solid and private and centered. The more we get close to all our reality, the more we are who we are. That is both you and I, not just me, but the usness in us. And I think this is very much what Hannah de Yeager and Amy are going to be pointing toward, which is another way of saying, says Francisco, that my mind is not my mind. It is a mind that requires interbeing. There is naturally that kind of concern and care and solidarity. But it is not just how nice I am or how good a guy I am. It has nothing to do with this. It has to do with how real things are in reality, that non-distinction between the intersubjective network of things. When it's considered for what it is, when it is absorbed or lived or embodied for what it is, it works precisely in that mode of care and concern. And he finishes this piece, he says, you see, the Buddhists have a wonderful message saying that compassion is the natural condition of what one really is. So this, I believe, is the underlying, if you will, perfume or flavor of what our different members are going to be exploring together. How we enact not only hope, but how we realize who we really are, which is Amy is suggesting. It's when our sense of subjectivity has expanded, not just to include the intimate other, but as Evan is pointing to, and as Adam and Richie and John are pointing to, how we come in relationship to our atmosphere, to our forests, to our rivers, to those who are excluded, and actualize the experience of hyper intersubjectivity, or what Thich Nhat Hanh has called interbeing.
Thank you so much, Roshi. So from our faculty members, our panelists for this particular session, any other words before we close that you'd like to offer? And you can feel free to simply unmute yourself.
I just wanted to note, I mean, just how touching it was, all of you describing those of you who were in the room that time. You know, there's something about intellectual friendship. I mean, for deep friendships that are also, you know, part of exploration. I had a friend of mine, a Dutch friend, who I met by the first year I was there, Hans van Hulst. And he and I, you know, I used to call him the artist of the everyday, because he had this way of going about life. He was a philosopher and a screenwriter, and he passed about 12 years ago. And I so deeply miss him. Because there was just nobody else I could have conversations like that with. And I can see, Roshi, just as you were talking about Francisco, I can see that, you know, I just caught that sense of like, oh, right, this is not just you guys all work together and everything and develop, but there was that sense of there's, you know, this adventure, which is fun and you laugh and all the other stuff, you know, it's not just serious. So just, you know, I was touched to see that. And I didn't recognize that before. So.
Thanks, Adam.
You know, Evan has pointed to this in various places in his writing and said something earlier today about it. In my personal relationship with Francisco, which mostly centered around the development of our Center for Consciousness Studies at the University of Arizona, my experience of him was both as extraordinarily kind and generous, supportive, and at the same time, as a part of that kindness, fiercely critical. Yeah, he said what he saw. And of course, he worked very hard at seeing clearly. And that's something that I'm perpetually grateful for.
Evan?
I think what everyone has said is there's nothing really that I can add to it at this point. I will, have a lot to say tomorrow morning. So I think the words that, you and Al were just speaking were wonderful. So I don't want to take away from them in this moment.
I hear some of echoes of some of this actually in what you're going to present, Evan, but also your Dharma talk. I don't think you mentioned that you did the Dharma talk, and I think people might want to. Thanks for sending that to me, by the way.
Yeah.
I think people might want to listen to that too. I'm gonna maybe have a few things to say about it, but
I'm sure you will. I'm sure you will. Yes. So I gave the Dharma talk just this past Wednesday, and it was called Enacting Hope. And I am going to talk about hope tomorrow, but the larger philosophical backstory, as I see it, about hope, I presented on Wednesday. So if you go to if anybody's interested and they want to go to the Upaya YouTube channel, I think it's up there now, and you can listen to it and see the slides that I used with it as well.
So Noah, maybe you can put it also on the resource page for
It's there.
Varela. Oh, it's already there.
Yep.
Great.
Yeah, and it's in the chat also for those of you who are listening right now.
And
Speaking-
by the way, Ev, Rebecca Solnit says, we should all do a book together on hope.
Oh, wonderful.
So
well, that's high praise. I'm happy she heard the talk then.
she heard the talk. Actually, she listened to it several times.
Oh,
and
wonderful.
she messaged me, let's collaborate. So I'll put you two in touch with each other.
Oh, thank you. That would be really nice. That's wonderful.
I was going to say, I hope that you will, but mostly I just hope.
That's right.
Inside joke.
Richie.
You have to attend his Dharma talk to get it. Richie.
I really just want to express my appreciation. I have nothing more to say tonight. And I'm really looking forward to this weekend.
Thank you.
So I just want to, finish up with this notion of the fragility of the self making emergence possible, and for us to let that turn a little bit into our contemplation before we meet tomorrow morning. And
Roshi, can I say one thing about this?
Yes.
Fragility of the self also makes a certain kind of, you might say, fear possible too. In other words, the circling of the wagons that we see so much now. So that it's a two-edged sword, really. That communal creation of the self is, I just want to emphasize how important it is for us right now to acknowledge the way in which we see in our society exclusion at its height. So fragility is.
I think you're very influenced by the article that you just sent, and I'm not sure that's what Francisco meant when he was speaking about the fragility of the self.
Indeed, but I just thought I'd raise it.
We'll tangle later. So just to share the schedule, tomorrow morning at 7, we'll have meditation, which will be guided lightly, not heavily. And then we gather, that's at 7 a.m. Mountain Time. And then at 10 a.m. Mountain Time, we'll jump in, to all of us together. The first presentation, as you know, will be by Evan, who frequently sets the course that our ship is sailing in, but we don't know what waters we'll find ourselves in, Evan. Always with you, there are surprises. And the day concludes at 4 5:30, we have another meditation practice, which will be fundamentally in silence, and we'll repeat the same schedule on Sunday. And I just thank you, Al, and Ev, John, Richie, Adam, for gathering tonight, and all of you, and see you tomorrow. One hopes.
Indeed. Have a good rest, everyone.